here. All right, today I'm going to be going over this proof of concept for PrintNightmare. Okay, so first off, right, so this is going to be my attacker environment, this Ubuntu box, and the target environment is this Windows 10 machine, right? So the exploit code that we're trying to run here is net user, and say, you know, the person I want to add is Candy with some password, right? So first off, will this succeed? You know, audience participation here.
Depends on your user, I guess.
Yes. So how can I?
Add users you can.
What was that?
You get permission to add users you can.
Exactly. So how can I verify that on do you know potentially how I can verify that on the console?
Do who am I? Just see who you are and then see your privs.
Yeah, so there's who am I, so there's my user, and then I can do who am I priv, right, to show the priv, right? So according to this information, my guess is that I don't have that permission, right? So if I go net user add Candy password add, right, access denied, and we go net user, right, these are the current users, so Candy was not added. So that's number one. Number two, I just want to show is that this is the directory that the exploit will add a file to. And in this case, it's my DLL file, right? And the DLL file itself, let me just do a dir here, right? So this is the DLL file itself, right? Candy.dll. So we're presupposing, so obviously my account here is Neo, and I can add files to my own account. So I just add this candy.dll file to my directory, right? And so what is candy.dll? Candy.dll, right, is I use MFS Venom to create this DLL file. And what it does is it's going to execute a command program. In this case, it's going to do that net user, and then it's going to add this Candy user with that password, right? So that's what's happening here, right? So, okay, we go back to here. And then, so this is the script that the POC that I'm running, right? So you run Python 3, the name of it. So the user here, name, and then the IP address, and then the actual DLL. So those are the arguments you need, right? So you run it. Okay, it asks for a password. So this is an important detail about this exploit. This exploit requires a user with credentials. So, right, so keep that in mind. So we run it, and lo and behold, right, at the very end here, it says routine failed. So according to what we're seeing, what would be your guess? Did this exploit work or not?
It looks like it did. It looks like the initialization process just didn't get called.
So potentially, right? So yeah, so you're seeing here in the output that one of the APIs is getting called. So that would be your assumption about why the exploit probably worked. Are there any other opinions? Okay, doesn't.
Well, it looks like it says like add print driver EX on one of those lines, like the line next line.
Okay.
That makes me assume that your driver got there.
That could potentially be the case as well, right? So you guys are more experienced, and so you guys are able to sort of parse it better. In my experience, most pen tester red teamers, what they'll see is they'll see this error message right here, right? They'll see this error DLL init failed, and they're like, hey, the exploit did not work, right? So
yeah, that was my guess.
Sure, that was my guess. Yeah, that was my guess as well. So what happened was that I was like, man, this failed, you know, something's up for whatever reason, it's not working. So to validate that, right, on this side, right, we could run the net users command and then check it out, right? It did add the Candy user, so it did succeed. So my point there is that sometimes the tool itself, depending on how it was programmed, it can give you certain messages, but that doesn't necessarily mean it either succeeded or failed. What you have to do is you have to validate it yourself, right? So that is in a nutshell. Okay, and then one more aspect, right? So right here in this directory right here, right? It uploaded it successfully to this directory, and this is one of the artifacts, right? So the Candy DLL is there. So that concludes the demo portion of it itself, and I'm going to go into other aspect of it. So, you know, one question here is like we validated that it was able to add a user. My regular account, Neo, did not have that permission. I ran the exploit, it was able to add it. So another question right here, right? So say I'm an admin. And it's like, okay, I find this malicious file. I want to clean it up. So according to my current access right now, will I be able to delete this file?
No.
And why not?
Well, because looking at your privileges, I don't think that you had the ability to have access to the administrative shell. And I think only people in the administrative shell group can perform changes to the system32 directory.
Exactly. You're spot on, right? You're completely correct. So when I asked to do this, right, it gives me this prompt right here, where it's asking the credentials for the admin user, which I don't have, right? And then so it failed, right? So you're spot on. And so I'm going through some of these details that for the more experienced red teamer, it's very sort of basic for them, but these are the details that I feel are necessary to upgrade your skill level if you're just sort of a beginner or very average red teamer, to improve it. And also very specifically for the CyberForce competition for the students, these are all the different details that you need to sort of really learn and really understand, right? So with that, the next part I wanted to sort of really jump into is the information that was given about this vulnerability itself. So in all the earlier articles.
So 1 second.
What's up?
1 second before you jump into that.
Yeah.
Have you dropped your DLL into dnspy just to see what the function name's called?
Okay. Let's see.
We don't have to do it now. I'm just curious if it has an init function.
Okay. Maybe after this we can do that to sort of get that information. So, but yeah, that's another really good skill level, and that's the right thing to think about, how to get a better understanding of how it really works, right? In terms of, okay, is there this init function, because we're getting that init error from the actual script itself, right? So the next part I wanted to get into is all the information that was released about this exploit, PrintNightmare, and it has been a mess because there's so many conflicting information and a lot of confusion about how it actually works. Was it patch? Was it not patch? Originally, they said it was a local privilege escalation, which I believe it is, but then they said they upgraded to remote code execution. So now I want to sort of get into this discussion in terms of, is it correct to categorize it as a remote code execution? I have a lot of issues with it being called that. If they called it authenticated remote code execution, I would have been perfectly happy with that. I would have no complaints if they said authenticated remote code execution. So one of the things that I know Kuntz has some opinions on is, if you're able to get a remote desktop, for all intents and purposes, according to Kuntz and I's opinion, you can trivially get a shell, the equivalent of a netcat shell or a bash shell in the Linux world. We feel like you can get the equivalent of a cmd.exe. It's trivial if you have a remote desktop, right? That's what our experience is from doing a lot of exploitation. But some people can be pedantic about that and says, no, that's not the same thing, right? So in this case, the fact that they labeled it as a remote code execution, but you still needed to have a working account. So what's the opinion of either Kuntz or Jesse? What's your take on it?
I think it's valid because you can install like printer drivers on like a server or like on a different computer, even though you still need creds for a low-level user. Like, I still feel like it's remotely executable.
So number one, I would say you're sort of jumping steps in terms of, it's true that you're able to add DLLs, and from your understanding of different techniques, you can trivially get DLLs to execute. But I would say that would require perhaps a chain, like you have to have some other mechanisms to execute that DLL. So that's not an automatic.
Does it
for remote code execution?
I haven't looked into this a little bit, but has it done, or have anybody looked at doing the whatever poison, like network poison, LOMR, and just like forwarding PrintNightmare stuff through that?
So I think I did another one about either constraint or unconstrained delegation using some techniques similar to that, but not that specifically. And I haven't seen anyone use what you're saying. I don't think anyone explored that.
Let
And
me,
that sounds like the chain that Kenny was going after there too. Like, I think the assumption is, at least my assumption is mostly is you have to be some kind of domain user on the network and have
Yes.
access to a computer that then can go ahead and put those things on the deal that either makes it remotely, right?
Sure.
Or locally via print servers or a print server in the sky.
Exactly. Yeah, you're spot on. So that, and with that, I want to jump to this other one of these other articles. I think it was this one right here, right? So this one is very good. So that's why I feel like people who don't actually do exploitation, they say remote code execution, and they equate it to something equivalent as an MS 08067 or MS 17-010, and those are unauthenticated RCEs. And so that, I feel like that's a different category, right? So you don't want to, I don't think it's fair to mix PrintNightmare with those exploits. But anywho, I really like this particular article because it spells it out. You need to be an authenticated actor, and it's going to allow you to run arbitrary code execution with system, right? So this article was very clear on that. So, I give props to them. So so my understanding of why you can call this a quote unquote remote code execution, I prefer to call it authenticated, is the way they're sort of trying to distinguish that, I believe, is that they're assuming you don't have access to something like remote desktop, RMI, remote RM, or some of these other mechanisms where an authenticated user can, or a PS exec, right, to execute commands because they have credentials. So in that case, if you don't, if that user doesn't have those mechanisms, then they can use this to quote unquote get authenticated remote code execution. So I would agree with them in that sense of why they make that distinguishing, that demarcation. But I feel like unless you sort of really know the nuance of that, it gets lost on you, and you might believe it's more scary than what it actually is. It's very scary, but it might not be to the level of scariness that some people who don't have that technical background is able to distinguish. So yeah, that was a really good conversation. And the last part I want to talk about is how people usually consume this information, right? So I feel like perhaps maybe 10 to 20% of the people in our community, cybersecurity, information security, they have the skills and the knowledge to do research on these kind of topics and sort of distill it into various mediums of articles, and then basically they sort of share these information in these reports and articles, and then the whole community, we consume this information, right? That's how I feel like it works. You have like a small set of content creators. They create the actual information, and then us as a community, we consume it. So the part of the conversation I want to get now is the level of detail that you're able to make sense of it. And I feel like most people, because they don't have that technical detail of sort of, what is RPC add that, or, what Kuntz and what Jesse were saying here, right? What the heck is this RPC add printer EX, and what's the heck is this RPC add printer? Most people, when they say it, they're just repeating it, but they don't really know what it means, unfortunately, right? So for them, they're just like reading the article in like maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and they'll just say the same thing. And to them, the only information they'll use is like, okay, this is a vulnerability, where's the patch? Okay, I'm gonna apply the patch, and I'm hoping that patched it. And on the pen testing side, what we do is like, okay, we find a POC, and then we're like, okay, this is the exploit code. Let's run it against a target machine. Okay, if it works, maybe it's vulnerable. We know it's vulnerable, but if it doesn't work, are we sure it's not vulnerable? So a little background about what I did here for this vulnerability. So at first, I tried to run this exact exploit against a test network. And in that test network, for whatever reason, it did not work. But the person who runs the network, he assured me, and he's an expert. He knows that it works. It works. But according to the level of, so I was 2 hops away, I was given a certain account, and according to the conditions of where I was at and the exploit code I was using, it did not work, right? But that doesn't, but again, this is why it's really important for the CyberForce competition, right? In terms of if that was where I stopped and I said, hey, I ran it against this test lab environment, it didn't work, then therefore, this POC is bad, or that environment must have been secured. And then that wasn't the case at all. And what I ended up doing is I created my own VM environment, and I ran into my VM environment, and it worked, right? So those are some other important details. And then to quickly go into that, right? So initially, when this was released, the news, all the articles, they said, the way they were communicating about it, they said it sounded like you had to be a DC in an Active Directory environment, right? And my VM is not a DC, it's not a server, it's just a Windows 10 spot. So then it's like, wait a minute, like, we have conflicting information here, right? So that's why there's all these aspects of it that really muddles it. And unless you sort of spend a lot of time in digging it, and for me personally, I don't have that time for this particular vulnerability to dig, but hopefully others who are sort of in that position that have to get that, they'll be able to jump in and dig, right? And then the last thing before I conclude is that, okay, let's see here. Okay, so in a lot of red teams, this is what the information they will give you, right? So this claims that this is technical details. But if I was interested in knowing how the actual vulnerability works, this is not technical detail, right? It just says affected systems, right? And it gives a little blurb like, these are the versions that are affected. That is not technical detail. But then when they give some information, this is the information they give, right? They give how do okay, this is the part I'm talking about right here. Usually for pen testing red teamings, this is the amount of information that we get from our side. We get, okay, this is a script, and this is how you run the script, and then full stop, right? In terms of, hey, how do you actually mitigate it? What does it actually mean? How does it really work under the cover? We usually don't get to that level, because usually on the red teaming pen testing side, for most places, all they care about is just, how do you run this tool? What are the arguments? If it works, I'm ready to go, right? So that's a certain level. So the level that we want to get ideally, and personally for myself, for this exploit, I'm not at this level yet, right? So that's honestly right there. And okay, now this is real technical detail, right? From this site right here, it actually gives all, really goes down into weeds here, right? It says, first the client did this, right? And then it's like, okay, you have to have ensured that, it's in a place. And then, okay, these are all the different arguments you need in the actual code itself, right? And then, okay, there's this data structure that's happening on the operating system side called a driver container. I don't know what a driver container is, right? But if you're at that level where you're like, I need to validate at the very lowest level, did this patch really patch the vulnerability? And the history for this vulnerability was the first patches that Microsoft rolled out did not patch the vulnerability, right? But how can you validate that? Well, you need to have this level of skill where you're able to actually go in and reverse engineer the binary to get that information. So with that, right, so I'm kind of due on time. So I'm going to conclude this demo, but I sort of, really want to harp and sort of emphasize the point that for these different exploits and technologies, there's these different levels of details and understanding you could have on it. And depending on your role and what your responsibilities for it, you might have to sort of dig at a certain level or stay at a certain level. But for other, you have to dig really deep. And hopefully for places like the CyberForce competition, we'll have opportunities to test the students on this level of depth. And another really quick comment, if this was used for the CyberForce competition, the red team does not dock points. We can only give points in CyberForce competition. So the way it would work would probably be, the red team runs this, and then if it works, then the way we score it is like, we'll ask the blue team, like, find all the artifacts or find detections of hey, where are the artifacts or where are all the indicators of this exploit? So that's one scoring opportunity, is finding all the indicators of the exploit actually working. And then another might be cleaning it up. And then another scoring opportunity is after work, we're like, okay, now apply all the different mitigations or different activities that will remove the vulnerability, right? So that way, then they could have a before and after, like, okay, this was your machine state when the vulnerability worked. Now, after you did some of these activities, now the vulnerability is no longer there. So with that, I'm going to conclude.